Recording in progress.
And then scavenger hunt and homework and such. How's everyone doing? Yes. Some of you have sent in your projects and some have not. So those who haven't, please send it in. We'll be working behind the scenes to help you. Judge Ian and I can help you do your research and such. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us during the week. But does anybody have any questions before we get started? I'm really happy to have you back, Steve. So when I took this class in 2015, Steve was here to share this, and it really illuminated so much history in Portland that I never was very aware of. That you'll go. It's very illuminating. So I'm going to bring Steve up to the class, and we'll share.
Okay. So this is a small group, and we can be a little bit informal. So if you have a kind of factual question, or like I said something you didn't understand during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand and we'll break. Let's keep the theoretical and philosophical debate questions till the end, though, so that we can get through it and have enough time for some of those. So what I'll say is this presentation was initially put together the first time in the 70s that the cities did a citywide transportation plan. And this was a shorter version of this was a prep presentation at public meetings so that people were kind of up to the same standard of understanding how the city got to be the way that it is before they started talking about how they wanted to change it. So next, thank you. And so in some ways, what this presentation is about is, this is a view in the late 60s from Pittock Mansion, is explaining why these lines of light are where they are and how they got there over time. Again, this is the downtown and then Hawthorne, Belmont, et cetera. Next. But to do that, it's kind of helpful to step way back and look at it from a distance. Because mostly we're talking about Euro-American settlements, we're going to start there. We'll work backwards. We'll see some overlap. But to start with, let's start here. And to us today, it seems odd, given how much bigger Seattle and Tacoma is than we are, why the early settlements are here. But this map reveals it, I think, because the major mode of transportation was on the water. If you had anything heavy, you wanted to put it on water. And so they knew in 1810 that Puget Sound was a better harbor than Portland was. But the thing to notice is that this location at the juncture of the Willamette and the Columbia is the place that reaches the most different places in the whole Pacific Northwest. So if you want to trade in this area, this is the place to be because you can get things back and forth most easily to this location. And next slide. Well, so the thing to recognize is that ocean-going vessels can come up to this point, and then you transfer it onto small ships to go up, very small boats to go up these, up the Willamette or up the Columbia. And in the beginning, there was, while everybody kind of knew that this juncture between the Willamette and the Columbia was the place to be, there were various locations that competed to be the center. Fort Vancouver, where the Hudson's Bay Company had been, was the oldest one. Linton and St. John's were platted with the idea that they would become this main harbor and transfer point. Portland, Milwaukee, and then some locations down by Oregon City at the falls. All of those were looked at as places where ocean-going vessels could get to, and then they could transfer to the smaller boats and go further up. Portland essentially won that debate, partially because Captain Cooch declared that you could get around Swan Island, but in low water, but you couldn't get around Ross Island. But also because the founders of Portland built something called the Great Plank Road, which is a road through the West Hills or the Tualatin Mountains out to the Tualatin Valley, which was the primary agricultural area at the beginning. And so recognize that this place is founded in the 1840s. And so at the end of the decade, what it's doing is selling things to the California Gold Rush. And so you're trying to get your produce out of here or your logs out of here down the river into California. And that's what made the place grow initially. So they probably did better advertising also, you know, that's always part of what success, but that's really why Portland emerged as the leading location. Next. So the form of transportation in Portland is based pretty heavily on the topography, again, the Willamette River and the Columbia across the top and the Tualatin Mountains here. The thing to notice is that what we think of as the Central East Side today and all of these locations in Northwest are marshes at this time. So they're not good locations to build a city. And there's a lot of other places that aren't good locations because they're either at the top or at the bottom of a bluff. They don't actually have good water access. Downtown Portland is located as one of the few places where you could actually bring a ship up to nearly solid ground and transfer goods from a ship to a dock. It isn't a very big area, but it works for that purpose. And so that's why it's here. Next. Oh, excuse me, can you go back one? I forgot one. The other thing to notice is this gulch. So we call it Sullivan Gulch. It's actually not a riverbed. It's where when the ice dams in Montana broke a couple thousand years ago and too much water poured down the Columbia, this is one of the ditches that was dug when all of this area went underwater for a short while, over and over again. So there's this ravine that doesn't have any water in it. And you'll notice that every time we want to introduce a new kind of transportation, we stick it in the gulch. Next. This is, as it says, an 1852 map, the first survey of the area. Here's downtown Portland. The thing to notice about it, it's a grid. I'll talk about it a little more, but the most important thing is that it's not a grid that's oriented to the north-south, it's oriented to the river, because the river is what matters to these people. And the other thing to notice is that essentially the sort of arterials, the power boulevards of the world, the king boulevards of the world, they're already in place in 1852. And what they are is, so this is the Native American Trail which is now Sandy and Cully and Columbia. It's the way they got to the gorge, up to the gorge for fishing. This is the way you went up to Willamette Falls on what's now Milwaukee Avenue. These paths through the hills to get to Tualatin, they're all Native American trails. And the Native Americans had picked routes that had the least amount of work for walking and took the least amount of energy. And so, of course, the people who came afterwards just took them over. So the basic network is already in place, as well as including King Boulevard, what's now King Boulevard, as the way to get across the Columbia. So they're all there. And they're just inherited and disused. Next. Here's a view in the 1860s of downtown Portland. It's as if you were in a helicopter over the Central East Side. A couple things to note is how focused it is on the river, how the wharves are here. The blocks are really small. No one really knows why the founders decided that a 200 by 200 block was the right thing to do, because they didn't explain themselves. They never wrote it down. They just did it. The explanation that's often used is that it gives you more corner lots, and corner lots sell for more money than other lots. But whether that's really true or not, they don't say. The other thing to notice is where we are, the park blocks, is the edge of town for these people. This is not the center. They didn't think of the park as something they were putting in the middle of the city. They thought of it as the place that was the boundary between the city and the farmland beyond. Next. Here's a view looking south on Front Avenue in early 1860s. A couple things to notice. We've got mixed use buildings with retail and office and housing above on the waterfront, and there's wharves behind it. And the other thing is clearly through traffic doesn't matter much here. You know, we just pile stuff up wherever we want it. We have wood here. You can actually see here's a ship, the mast of a ship. So what this really is a place to trade. It's primarily a location for trading. And the forest is really close. Next. The other thing that's really shaping the form of the city, of the street, of the transportation system of the city and the subdivisions of the city is the Donation Land Claim Act, which I think you may have heard about or know about otherwise, but it essentially, under the Jeffersonian system, the whole of the United States was subdivided into townships and ranges 6 miles on a side, and they surveyed them all the way across the country. And then they wrote laws in the 1850s that allowed a couple could claim 320 acres, a single male could claim 160 acres. Females couldn't claim, only white people could claim, the usual exclusions. And nobody worried about the fact that the Native Americans hadn't actually said, you know, it's okay, yeah, sure, take the property. But setting all that aside, if you built a house on it and lived on it for 5 years, it was yours at no cost to you. So the original settlers, you can see they're locating their parcels, and they're locating them oriented to the river. The very first ones in downtown Portland and in the St. John's and Linton area. And then in 1852, when that first map was that I showed you earlier was made, the reason they were making it is because they made these surveys of the mile grid. And this was the baseline of that grid, sometimes called Baseline Road, now called Stark Street. A mile south of it.
There's a spot with wire with it doesn't exist anymore.
What?
There, right there. It doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
What is that?
And that is the Central East Side industrial area. In the early 20th century, the city filled those marshes to create more industrial land, as other people did up here and elsewhere. So here's Stark, Division, Holgate, Broadway, Fremont, Prescott, even in Southwest. There are some of the, in hilly Southwest, there are a couple of those streets. So the Native American trails create the main structured roads that we used into the 20s and 30s for long distance travel. And this property owner division, because people just put their property lines next to these lines, they become the kind of secondary streets, secondary arterials, whatever, collectors, whatever you want to call them, that outline our city system. Next. And again, just for, you saw that drawing from the 1860s of downtown. That is the most settled area. This is the farmhouse of Clinton Kelly at Southeast 26th and Powell, where the demonstration is going on right now. And it's where Cleveland High School is today, just for your orientation. And so the Kellys had, a number of the Kellys had farmland. They got these donation land claims. They would build a farm here. Next slide. This is their barn. You know, they have a horse and they have work wagons, and they have fancier wagons. And, you know, maybe once a week they actually go somewhere off the farm. Not a lot of travel, because they're pretty much staying on their farm. Next. So it doesn't really take much road to be successful. This is the Great Plank Road, actually as late as 1896. So this is the road that made Portland come to be the largest center in the Pacific Northwest. It is now where the Sunset Freeway is. So think of the change in scale that we're looking at here from this little, you know, barely a one-lane road, and that you're going to build into a 6-lane freeway, pretty much just for local traffic today, right? You know, the scale of the system has changed really dramatically. Next. And you know, one of the reasons a small road can be like that, this is actually downtown Hillsborough, but you know, once a week the farmers come to town to sell their produce and buy the stuff they need, and they're not moving around very much, and they come with their wagons and they set up their wagons here to sell produce, or they sell it wholesale to someone. And so there's just not that much travel. Next. As the city begins to grow and adding population, the farmers who are close in decide, you know, I can make more money by selling off my land as a subdivision than if I keep farming it, you know, or they reach the age where I'm 65, I don't want to farm anymore, I'm going to sell it. My son went to San Francisco and made money into this. Why, you know, all those usual things. They sell off their land. And because downtown Portland is 200 by 200 blocks, pretty much they have one of their dimensions will be 200 by 200 when they subdivide. They're just following. If they're close in the Central East Side, they tend to be the same 200 by 200. Out here, this happens to be King Boulevard and Woodlawn, the Woodlawn, some of you may know the Woodlawn Triangle. This is an example. We'll come back. There's a railroad running up here, and there's a station here. So this subdivider, he orients his subdivision not to the north-south grid, but to where the station is, because the station is what's important to him. The guy who subdivides this piece doesn't really care if his lines up, and you can see that it's almost like they were working not to line up. And since travel is mostly by walking or riding on horses, it doesn't really matter. Next slide. And that's why if you go into a lot of places in Southeast or in the Albina, North Portland area, you'll find these kind of jobs, because this is the break between one subdivision and the next. So essentially we've got these big roads like Powell that were given to us by the Native Americans. We've got the mile grid that gives us the collectors, and we have the broken system of local streets that results from a subdivision pattern that's not really controlled by anybody. Nobody is planning it ahead. They're just subdividing their property into lots. And when they subdivide into lots, all they're doing is subdividing into lots. They are not building streets at this point. They're not building houses. They're just subdividing property and selling you a vacant piece of property. Next. Into this landscape then, we get new forms of transportation. The first one is the Transcontinental Railroad. Came to Portland in 1883. Where did they put it? They put it in the Sullivan's Gulch. This is actually an early 20th century view of that gulch. And you know why Sullivan's neighborhood likes a blackberry festival, because it's full of blackberries. And as you can see, there's no real stream in it. It's just a ditch. It's a long ditch. Next. The other kind of railroad we get is for local transportation, because the city begins to get a little too big for walking from one place to another. So this is what's now Southwest First Avenue. The Burnside Bridge would be right about here. This building is still there. All the rest of them are gone from this picture.
What year?
This would be 1873, I think. And you can see that the street is a dirt street. They've put rails in it, and here are the horses, and it's a horse-drawn, but on rails, streetcar system, horse car system, as they would call it. And the reason they put them on rails is because the same horse can pull about 30 times the weight, the load on, if it's on a steel rail than if it's in the mud. So it's an efficiency measure. Next. And we get a kind of a whole system of these things, pretty small, but a whole system. This is the intersection of Grand Avenue and Morrison Street, about 1887, just as the Morrison Bridge is opening. And these are the horse cars, and this is a transfer point from one system to another. So transit-oriented land use, somebody figures out, I can do a cigar shop, candy store here, and if I provide them a place that's out of the rain while they're waiting, I can sell them things. So, and because the streetcar or the horse car is the primary way of moving a long distance, everyone is going to use this at this point. Next. So this is a view of the Morrison Bridge. So this is the first bridge across the river. Again, it's 1887. It is not a public bridge. It is a privately owned bridge. You paid a toll to use it. That relates to current stories, doesn't it? So you paid a toll to walk across it, to ride a horse across it, to lead your sheep or cattle across it. And the more cattle you had, the more you paid. And the people who owned the bridge, some of them owned this streetcar line, so they charged you to ride the streetcar as well. Next. And they also bought some property between Hawthorne and, as you see, Baseline or Stark, and this is 30th Avenue today, and platted a subdivision called Sunnyside, and so they would sell you land to build your house on. These are all pretty much 50 by 100 lots. So here's what's now the Belmont bus line. Next slide. This is 33rd in Belmont, which was for 1 year, it was the terminus of the streetcar before it was extended out to Mount Tabor and Montevilla. And if you go out there today, this building is gone, but this is the core of the Belmont business district between 33rd and 35th, say. And it's there because it was a temporary, it was always a stop on that streetcar line. And again, this is a location where you could get on the streetcar. It's also the real estate office where they sold you the land, and it also had some other services as well. Next. And if you looked at a typical house that they would build, here's an example of the front porch is the orientation. The streets are very quiet because it's mostly people walking on it. They socialize at the front. The backyard is where you have your chickens and you hang out your laundry. It's a working area. So it's kind of a reverse of the way we use property in the 1970s and 1980s, where the backyard is usually your private socializing space for other people.
Were most of these homes built for sort of middle-class families, or
Well, it depends on, this one would be, I would say this would be middle class, yes. If you were more laboring, unskilled labor class, you might live in a building that looked very much like this, but there would be 3 or 4 units in it. There's also rooming houses that would be in the same place, in the same neighborhoods. If you wander around the Buckman neighborhood, you will see buildings that are both. The same thing down in Selwood, for example. There are some larger buildings that were rooming houses for people who worked at the lumber mills that were down on the river in those areas. Next. So in 1889, this is what that citywide streetcar network looked like. The west side, the downtown and up into at least the lower parts of Northwest is pretty well covered. There's no place that's missing service. On the east side, there's the line out Belmont to Mount Tabor. There's another one now that's out Hawthorne. There's a line that does this really weird squiggle that's called the Waverly Woodstock line. This is Woodstock Boulevard between 41st and 47th. Again, you know, where the Woodstock Business District is today is already set in place in 1889. And sort of similar up into this is the line that went up into St. John's into that area. And there's nothing anywhere else. Next. So here are those 2 lines, and the lines up there. And this is pretty obvious. People who own farmland along those streetcar, horse car lines or steam car lines, they're selling them off as subdivisions. So are a few other people, but you'll find that there's almost no development happening on those properties because there's no way to get there at this point. Next. What begins to happen is downtown Portland is not the only place to have stuff. So this is the intersection of Williams and Russell Street in the early 20th century. It's almost like a second downtown. It almost fulfills all the functions I used to say that Lloyd Center fulfills, but Lloyd Center doesn't fulfill those functions anymore. So this would be, you know, there was a department store here, a small one, but there was a department store here, drugstore, a lot of places to buy groceries, foods, your dentist, your doctor, and so on. And there's streetcars on both of these streets. So this is an intersecting location, so it's a good location to put this. This, jumping ahead a little bit, you may, if you think about it, know that dome, which is in the park up the street. This is an area that was cleared as an urban renewal project in the early 1970s, late 1960s. Next. And here's the Belmont at 33rd again. They've just torn down that wooden building I showed you in the earlier view. By this point, stores have emerged pretty continuously on both sides. This would be the early 20th century, 1915 or so. The thing to notice about it is how the street space is allocated. It's a 60-foot right away from building to building. And look how much of it is given over to sidewalks by comparison, even today. Next. Some of these buildings still exist also, particularly on the south side. So the other thing that's happening is we're beginning to get developers who start doing larger parcels. And this is William Sergeant Ladd, who, when he died in 1892, he was the wealthiest man in the Pacific Northwest. He had $5 million at that point, and he owned 4 or 5 farms. One of them was here, Ladd's Addition in Southeast Portland, which he platted. He also owned what's now Laurelhurst, Eastmoreland, much of Lake Oswego, inner Lake Oswego, and parts of Washington County as well. Some of it with other partners, and they were all sort of gentleman farm things. And you may know he had a house in the middle of downtown at the point where he owned the whole block. But he laid out this subdivision in 1891. And it was partially because the city was pushing him to lay it out, because the property owners out here wanted to lay out stuff and they couldn't because there was no street pattern. I think he was like, okay, I'll show you what a street pattern is. I'm gonna make it really hard for you to get from here to your property over here. But whatever his thinking was, he did end up creating streets of different types. Instead of all the streets being 60 feet wide and doing the same things, he's almost creating a classification system for you. And if you, next slide then. So he creates those two big diagonals, the through streets in his area. He creates local streets, and he also, oddly enough, does alleys. And he's one of the few who does alleys. There are some in Northeast Portland as well. And because Portland didn't have any in the beginning, it didn't become a tradition here. If you go to Seattle, they have alleys everywhere because the original platters put alleys in, and so it became the standard thing to do. Next. In the early 20th century, I should say Ladd developed his property. He platted it in 1891-92, and then he promptly died. And then the Depression came along, a big depression came along, and almost nothing happened until the early 20th century. But his development was the first development where they said, we're going to plat the property, build the streets, build the sidewalks, plant the street trees, but he's not building any of the houses. But he's doing everything else to create a neighborhood and not just to plat land. In the early 20th century, we get another form here. Again, these solid red lines are the streetcar lines at that time period. This is the main line. These are the main line railroads. But we get another form that's called, that's often called the interurban. Next slide, I'll show a picture of that. They are usually owned by the mainline railroads. They run longer distances, and they're designed to get people more out into the country. So Southwest Portland and East Portland, east of I-205, actually even a little closer in than that, is more developed around this form of transportation. And their stations are not, it's not a streetcar stop every 2 blocks, it's every quarter mile. And so you get more spaced out kind of developments and larger lots. This happens to be Multnomah Boulevard and the Multnomah Business District. This building still exists, at 35th, I think it is in Multnomah. And these trains would take you from Portland to Lake Oswego, or Portland to Beaverton and Hillsborough, or Portland to Gresham, or to Vancouver. But they also, like this line, went all the way down to Eugene. And just for orientation, there were 26 trains a day between Portland and Eugene in this time period. Because, yeah, well, by quite a bit, because there's really no other option. Next. So the kind of lots and subdivisions that you get in East Portland, for instance, even though it's generally flat land, that relates to the interurbans, are these larger blocks, and they're 100-foot by 300-foot lots. They're big lots. And the kind of idea was you could live here, you could have a job in town if you wanted with a longer commute, but you could also have an orchard here or a small farm that either you grew for yourself or that you could sell at a market. And so it's a larger scale. It's kind of, I don't really want to live in the middle of a city. There is a form of transportation that is public transportation that allows me to live in this way on a larger lot. And they're beginning to experiment with it. So you can sort of see where it's leading. Next. The other thing that these interurbans do is they let you get further out into the country. And so actually Oaks Park is the last remaining kind of recreational park down along the Willamette. This was Chautauqua at Gladstone, a place to go. This is people relaxing on a Sunday. It doesn't look, they don't look very, they're not dressed for relaxing as far as I'm concerned, but they think of this as relaxing. You could get out to several parks, Dodge Park, out beyond Gresham, out into the country as well. Next. So here's the network in 1906. It's pretty much the same, although now you can get all the way out to Lentz, and there's interurban lines that you can get to. And this, the north part of Northeast Portland is, or of North Portland is full, but nothing really to the east of there yet. Next. So that, here's what the development looked like. This is 1905, where housing was developed, and you can see all of Northeast is, there's some roads in it. You know, Sandy Boulevard and Cully Boulevard are there, but that's it. There's not much really, there's not much development going on. Next. 1906 is kind of a point at which Portland realizes, uh-oh, Seattle's going to pass us if we're not careful. And so they do what a lot of cities try to do. They do a World's Fair, the Lewis and Clark Exposition, to try to pump up the business. They hire the Olmsted brothers to come and do a park plan. So we have a park and boulevard plan that's done. This is that plan. The only thing that was built, next slide, at the, this first stage was Terwilliger Boulevard, but that's how we got Terwilliger Boulevard, or they called it Hillside Boulevard at the time, looking out over downtown. The only thing that hasn't changed is that we still have the same streetlights on this street, but otherwise, a lot of change. Next. So between 1906 and 1912, so after the fair, there's a lot of sub property that's subdivided, and we go from a situation where I think about 1907, the streetcar is extended out Sandy, and the streetcar is extended out Gleason, and there's a streetcar on Alberta. And so all of this area within a 5-year period gets streetcars and gets platted and laid out. And 1912 is like the system when it's at its largest extent. The streetcar system is its largest extent. The highest ridership is 1919 as the, so there's this period where people aren't quite sure. Beyond by 1912, there's the beginning of car culture, but they're not really sure what it's going to do. So they're still developing everything on the assumption that what happened in the streetcar era is what the way the world is going to be. Next. And if you were to come to downtown, this is downtown Portland, as it says, 6th and Alder in 1912, I think is the year. And the thing to notice is, well, the speed limit for cars is 6 miles an hour everywhere. Streetcars are allowed to go 12. And people are what we call jaywalking everywhere, right? Because you can really outrun, if you have to, something at 6 miles an hour. So this is like the period in which if you want to sell to anybody within the state, this is the place you need to be, because it is the most accessible location within the city, within the metropolitan area, within the state of Oregon. So this is when it's most intensively used. And so if you're a dressmaker, your shop is probably on the 6th floor of this building, not on the ground floor, unless you really have a big business. There's Christian Science reading rooms, which are all on the ground floor today, would have been even into the 1940s and 50s on the upper floors of these buildings, because these places are so intensively used. Next. And you can see that here. This is a shop space that's about the length of a parked car. There's a ground floor shop. There's another floor shop on the mezzanine up above, and the same thing on each side, and then these shops. So it's just a really, really intensely used place. Not a lot of people compared to the way it is today. You know, the city is about 200,000 or so, 150, 200,000. It's in that range instead of 680,000. But if you're wanting to be in a very accessible location, this is where you need to be. Next. In 1912, a business association working with the city decides to do a plan for the whole city. This is a view of what they thought the city should look like as a result of that plan. It was called the Bennett Plan. They tried to hire the planner who did the Chicago plan, and this is his assistant. We got his assistant. But the image is still Paris. If you look at it, all the buildings are 6 or 7, 8 stories tall. They didn't really erase the few taller buildings that were already there, but they are essentially putting that same kind of system over the whole city. And in their minds, when they talked about the numbers, from the Tualatin Mountains to about 82nd Avenue was a city of 2 million people. That's what they were planning for. They had a very different idea about what it's like. Next. All of that kind of got disrupted by the introduction of the automobile in about the same time. This happens to be a postcard that I found. It's a dentist in Forest Grove, and he is offering it on the back to drive you into Portland when he needs to go into Portland. And what they would do, they were called jitneys. They would run about 5 minutes in front of the interurban or the streetcar and pick people up for the same fare. You can see that the streetcar company got that outlawed at some point fairly quickly for this sort of competition, but it's an interesting kind of point, you know, as we look today at what is okay with Uber and what's okay with Lyft and what's not okay. This is in a time period when the city isn't regulating it very much at all. The only thing the city is doing is for the streetcar companies, they're giving people a permit and saying you're going to get the sole ability to build a track in Southwest 4th Avenue, and you have to build it this way. But that's all so they're giving them a franchise, it's called. That's all it is. They're not putting any money into it. All the street work is being done by the company or private landowners. The public is not really very active in any of this. And they're not very active as the car comes along initially either, because why should we jump into all this? So this is, you can see it's a Studebaker. He's offering this service. It begins to change a lot of things. Next. You have a car, you have to figure out where to park it. So a lot of the Victorian houses get modified. Their basement gets turned into a garage in the early years. People trying to figure out how to do it. Next. The Great Plank Road, we're in downtown Hillsborough again. Planks are fine if the speed limit is 6 miles an hour and you're traveling across these planks. Once you're going 12 or 15, this is really, really uncomfortable. So they're lifting up the Great Planks, their planks. You can tell that we're in old growth timber country by the size of these timbers. For the last time, and they're paving the street for the first time this is again about 1912 in downtown Hillsborough. Next. You have to have traffic management. So this is, I think it's Officer Bender at the intersection of 3rd and Alder. And he's got a post that says go in one direction, or he turns it 90 degrees and it says stop. And that's how he controls the traffic. But he's standing the whole time in the middle of this street because the speed limit is still pretty slow. And so it's pretty safe. They haven't invented traffic lights yet. They haven't invented even stop signs at this point. Stop signs come later with the first version of police regulation that we have as stop signs, where they did an article in the paper and it said, when you approach Hawthorne, Belmont, Burnside, Gleason, and a couple of other streets, doesn't matter what cross street you're on, it doesn't matter what the right-of-way rules are, you have to stop and let those traffic go through and then wait for your chance. And they expected people to understand that without actually having put up any sign at all. So there aren't very many drivers, obviously, and they're all local, because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense to people. And the interesting thing is that people started using the same rules on other streets that they thought should be through streets. And then like 3 weeks later, the police are saying, well, this is interesting, you know, what's going on here, you know, people, so it's a sort of a self-regulating system, and the volumes, I guess, must have been low enough that they felt like it was okay to do that. And it was all new, so they're just experimenting with this. Next. So now we get more cars. By 1918, they do their first set of traffic counts. They also do their first, there's another map in this set that is the map of the streetcar counts as well. And they're basically the same streets. Because when you buy a car, if you've ridden the streetcar before and you want to drive to someplace, you're basically following the same route and you're wanting to get downtown and cross over on the bridges. Next. So we're counting, we're thinking about the future. Here's a view of Southeast 7th Avenue in what's now the Central East Side. Next. And here it is after they widen it. They're going around widening a lot of streets, tearing down the first row of houses and putting them on here or like on Belmont, taking those wide sidewalks and cutting them back to narrow sidewalks in order to have more travel space. Next. And the extreme version of that is the widening of Burnside in the late 20s and early 30s, following on to the building of the current Burnside Bridge. And you can see what they're doing here. It was originally a 60-foot wide street, the same as all the other east-west streets. They're widening it, and the way they widen it is this facade used to be here. They cut out 20 feet, they put the facade on rollers, and they rolled it back and reattached it to those buildings. And if you go and look, particularly on the north side, because on the south side, most of them have since been demolished, you will see that there are these buildings that used to be large, like 100 by 100 squares, and now they're 80 by 100. Their facades have been pushed back. On the east side, they didn't use that solution. The solution was to buy the first 10 feet of the ground floor only, move the sidewalk into that area. And that's why we have those buildings over there that are on, you know, that have arcades essentially along the street. They're trying to figure, because in their mind, they're planning for Paris. 2 million people in a very small area. Every street is the same. Every street has all modes of transportation in it at the same time. It's very, very active. Next. So this is, here's that newly widened Burnside Street. We're in the 30s and into the 40s. It's a pretty intensively used place still, but you can see there's a couple of surface parking lots that are starting to show up. Next. After the war, it's like there's a whole new set of rules. They begin to change. This is a house that is sort of, it's a real estate ad, obviously. It's a house that's kind of on the Gresham East Portland line. It's the backyard that's important, not the front yard. Next. During the war, Portland hired Robert Moses to come do a plan for the future, the post-war future, and called the Portland Improvement Plan. It looked at parks, it looked at highways outside of the metro area, and it looked at building a highway system. It's really as much a job creation program as it is a public works program. It's thinking when all these soldiers and war workers come, when the war's over, what are they going to do? Well, I guess maybe there's a whole bunch of stuff. We've gone through a depression and then we couldn't build anything during the war. We're way behind. We could do some stuff. So he proposes an inner loop of freeways, pretty close to where it ends up being. And he proposes an outer loop of freeways. What's interesting, this thing is about where I-205 is today, but it doesn't cross the river. It stays on this side. So he's still, if you look at his numbers, he's still imagining there's 2 million people going to be inhabiting this little area. And his views of what the city would have looked like is these are elevated freeways with 6-story apartment houses next to them. Question?
Is this post Interstate Highway Act?
No, it's pre.
Okay.
Interstate Highway Act is 1956. So this is he's kind of hinting at where it ought to go. And he's the first one to propose limited access highways that are only for cars and trucks. And all the previous improvements that you've seen, they're still trying to put all the modes in the same space. All of a sudden now, it's like, okay, there's some things we could learn from other places, and let's do modal separation. And that's where the freeways come in. And the car is the emphasis. Next. This is partially the war is over. They're very optimistic about what they can accomplish, how much they can build, and how much they can change. So just for orientation, again, this is the Lloyd area, Lloyd district, Lower Albina. This is the Steel Bridge and the Broadway Bridge in Sullivan's Gulch. What it's like just at the end of the war, just after the war. And you can see it's very densely packed. The first thing that happens is they decide, look, there's all this old housing, it's time to move it, get rid of it, tear it down. Actually, a good chunk of the PSU campus was an urban renewal area. All of the South Auditorium area down where the fountains are was urban renewal, was cleared, was primarily Italian, Jewish, Eastern European Jewish neighborhood. And then this area was the core of the African-American neighborhood in this area. All of them were slated for clearance, as well as some others that were never finished. So next, the first thing that happened is that area down near the river was cleared for Memorial Coliseum. Next. This is a private redevelopment. The Lloyd family had been buying up property above the gulch since beginning in the 1920s. And they tried to do something just before the Depression hit in 1929, and that obviously didn't go anywhere. In 1959-60, they built this shopping center. They're right next to the first freeway, and this freeway is actually just before the Interstate Act is passed. So it initially doesn't meet those standards. So we're sticking out a freeway in Sullivan's Gulch. The next thing in Sullivan's Gulch, get out of the way. There's railroad freeway. It keeps it out, out of people's way. But the land use demand, it doesn't do that. I mean, look at the parking lots. Basically, everything since the opening of the MAX line that we've done in this area is like, how can we fill up these parking lots with something else that's actually more useful? Next. Sullivan's Gulch is the only ditch we had. So when I-5 North, which was originally called the Minnesota Freeway because it replaced Minnesota Street, was built. And again, this is African-American, particularly the lower part of it is African-American community. They buy all the property in the blocks. They dig a ditch. They create a ditch. You can see they've actually built the overcrossings before they built the highway. So their image of what they're doing is basically replicating the Banfield, the Sullivan's Gulch, in a new location. It has a different effect because the shopping area that was on Mississippi at that point is now suddenly isolated from the residential area or half the residential area that supported it. So these shops begin to fail and change. Next. If you came downtown, this again is a postcard advertising Portland. Be careful crossing the street because it's very dangerous. This is Morrison Street, Southwest. This is Southwest Morrison Street. Pioneer Square is right here now. Next. So we get to this point where they're doing all these things for highway. There's a plan for building highways, freeways that would have had the Mount Hood Freeway, as well as the Banfield, a freeway on Fremont Street or Prescott going east-west, a freeway at 39th, a freeway at where I-205 is today, a really dense network of freeways. And that's when the freeway revolt starts. After they finish these first freeways, and people are beginning to see the effect, and they're thinking about, do we want more? And the answer is no. that's when the Mountain Freeway revolt occurs. The decision is made not to build the freeway. The decision is made to look at other options. The city begins to start something called the downtown plan, which is like, okay, how can the downtown exist without if it isn't going to get all this highway access, and begins to think about building their access around transit. So the idea of the transit mall on 5th and 6th Avenue, and a cross mall, which was supposed to originally be more shopping oriented, was there. And in 1979, this is the mall that was finished. It was a bus only mall at that point. Next. And the other big piece of it that relates to transportation is the only really major piece of the Moses system that was built was kind of expressway along the waterfront. And so that was built, and then next shot, that was removed in order to create waterfront park. But this gives you, if you compare this to the view in the late 50s, look at all the parking lots that have all been cleared out in this time period. Next. People start talking about maybe we should have some rail back. And the first line that was looked at, the first line to happen was the Max line to Gresham. And the idea is, like the interurban, we're going to have stations that are a quarter mile or a half mile apart. So they're more concentrated developments in fewer areas, not rather than continuous development like along Division or Hawthorne that we have today. Next. And in downtown, they had to figure out how to do it. It's sort of interesting to compare this to that early 20th century view of Belmont. The sidewalks, again, here are taking up about half of the 60-foot right of way. And then there is a car route and there is a light rail route as well. Next. So kind of in summary, there's this history of layers that we put in place that affect the city and the various systems we have. And the only one I'll show you of the update of the sort of current system is the pedestrian system, to help you sort of see this is where sidewalks exist in the city today. And you can see that it's essentially the same places where the streetcars were. So there's this symbiosis between, if you're going to have streetcars, people have to be able to walk to them. And so the city required sidewalks here. All these places which the city didn't annex until the 80s or 90s, or in this case, didn't annex until the 60s or 70s, don't have sidewalks. They are built around that interurban system. And so next, last slide. In some ways, you can sort of think about three different cities emerging out of this. In the middle, this streetcar transit-oriented network. In East Portland, a more car-oriented, larger scale network. And in the same thing in Southwest, it's larger, lower density, car-oriented, and very hilly as well. This is relatively flat, not really flat, but comparatively flat. And I guess what I'd say is, as you think about the future, the solutions that you apply here probably isn't exactly the same as the solution you apply here or here, because the topography and the history have set some rules that are very hard to change. And I guess what I'd say then is, in the 50s and 60s, when they did urban renewal and built freeways, they thought they could change everything to a car-oriented pattern. They can't afford it. The equity impacts of it are not fair. You know, they're not good. So they stopped doing it. And now we have to come back and look at this landscape and think, well, given that we're thinking about it from equity and these guys don't have sidewalks, how do we go about getting them sidewalks? How do we create a place that they have options and not just the car, but that we can afford, that they can afford, that work together? And what does that solution look like? And it really probably isn't the same. I mean, I would argue it's not the same in all of these places. You have to kind of be responsive to the history that's before you. Okay, thank you very much.
Steve. I'm so sorry. I have this coughing spell, and it's mainly because of the fire. But
Any questions for Steve? Philosophical questions, facts questions.
I'm just curious on the Near East Side, Ainsworth seems like it's kind of an interesting stretch that you don't see in a lot of places in the city. And do you know what the history is? Was that another rich person who decided that's how they wanted to lay out that promenade there?
Ainsworth is actually in the Olmsted plan, but it isn't implemented in the Olmsted plan, which is why it's implemented by the individual developers, which is why it's kind of bumpy. So if you go along it, it isn't continuous. And there are a couple other places. 72nd was another one that was identified for that kind of treatment. And if you think about 72nd north of Sandy, there's like a 4-block stretch with a median in the middle of it. And in southwest on 72nd, south of Mount Tabor, there's another 6-block stretch where the subdivider, oh, I'll follow that plan, that makes sense. And there's a couple others, Omaha is the other one, but it's very piecemeal.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really so much a question, but like, I like will walk around like, especially like southeast and see like the horse rinks like,
Right.
on the, yeah, was that ever like taken out or like who, I guess like who decided that we should still keep them? Like I'll see like construction to keep them too.
Yes, they were originally put in when the builders or the developers and the landowners put in the sidewalk. So they would have put them in, although they had to meet city specifications. They were taken out in many places as those sidewalks were re-poured or the new curbs were put in. When Ladd's Addition was turned into a historic, this is a good bureaucratic story. When Ladd's Addition became a historic district, they said, we want to keep those horse rings. And so the city council adopted a rule that said keep those horse rings. The Maintenance Bureau, which is part of the Office of Transportation, said, we can't figure out one place or another place, so we're just going to keep them all. We don't know how to deal with this. We don't want to set rules that are different from one place to another. So it's this, this is how we make decisions. Here, the other piece that you'll often see that represents an older period is sometimes at the corner there is a metal strip that's in the curve, and that's because with those narrow wheels that are that aren't tires, they're wooden wheels that are on a wagon. If they got up on that curve, they would break that curve, and the metal is designed to keep them from breaking the curve. Well, we don't need that anymore because everybody's got tires, but they're still there in some cases until they rust away. Anything else?
How would people get into Vancouver with the streetcar system? Is it like where Amtrak now is? Is that the building you get across to?
No, there was a streetcar that ran on King and the one that did the jog at Woodlawn. It went all the way to the south bank of Columbia. And actually, it actually went on kind of a bridge to Hayden Island. And then you got on a ferry boat and went to downtown Vancouver. And then there were some streetcars on the other side as well. And then when the bridge was the first bridge, what's the Interstate Bridge today, they built in, one of them they built about 1913, 1914. The other one wasn't built until the interstate highway system came in. That had streetcar tracks in it. And you could ride the streetcar all the way to Vancouver at that point. Anything else?
I have a question, so about trolley buses.
Uh-huh.
Did Portland have trolley buses?
Yes.
And then I guess what happened to them and why doesn't anyone talk about bringing them back?
There used to be a really strong advocate who wanted to bring them back. So there was an effort in the 70s and 80s. Great, if you want to start. One of my summer jobs was supposed to do that study on bringing trolley buses back, and it never happened. A long time ago, I got pulled off on something else. But it was a way of moving away from streetcars where there's all that work in the street and just having the overhead wires. And the lines that were busy or on steep hills, because originally the diesel motored buses couldn't go up like Vista Avenue or the steep places like that. And you can sometimes still see where they were. There were about 10 lines, I would guess, that you can see where they were because the pole at the corner is a metal pole rather than a wooden pole. So that it brings the power down. So at 28th and Gleason, there's one left at that intersection. And that's part of the returning the energy, returning the electricity. When you have a streetcar, you use the rails for that purpose. You can't do that with trolley buses. So you have to have some other way to bring the power, get it out of the system. But it was a pretty extensive network, and it's part of the whole, actually, or the GM, Firestone, and all that stuff. You can believe as much of it as you want, or I'm not really sure. I wasn't here, so I don't know. But they clearly were trying to sell people on moving to diesel-powered buses and getting rid of the streetcar. I guess the other thing I didn't say is when these streetcars were first built, they were separate. There were like 7 or 8 different companies. In 1906, they all were merged into a single company, and PGE is a successor to that company. They sold off the streetcar part to Rose City Streetcar. So they were originally called Portland Railway Light and Power. So it was a company that was essentially a really big monopoly, owned by East Coast millionaires, of course. Any other questions?
So where would be, what would be the plan for Portland's intent to build more pedestrian infrastructure in this Portland? Would that be in a current plan now that trying to lays out the infrastructure or proposal for that?
I don't think anybody's planning on 2 million anymore. The metropolitan area. The current plan allows quite a bit of intensification, and it'd be worth looking at that. And then in that last slide, you saw it overlays where the centers are, where development is supposed to be concentrated, and it tries to relate it to transit. It doesn't show very well. It's the pink. So the downtown and the various stations along the light rail and a couple other town centers. Those are the places of intense mixed use development. And then there are these other areas that allow now a range of not just single family, but also in some cases up to 6 units per lot, 6 to 8 units per lot, if they're affordable.
We talked about the decision to put the max at the street level and not underground.
Yeah, it was the advantage of light rail was perceived to be at the time is that you were able to choose relatively cheap construction options like surface running, and that was more appropriate for Portland. Seattle had taken a run at building a subway and completely lost. Actually, there was one commissioner here who proposed a freeway in the a subway in the 50s that ran under Powell Boulevard through downtown and then out Broadway to Hollywood. So there was a proposal. It didn't go anywhere. So the benefit of the light rail and the mix that we had that was perceived at that time was that you could run it on the downtown streets at the speeds and in the character of the downtown streets. You could run it at in the Banfield parallel to the freeway at 60 miles an hour between the stations. And you could run it on East Burnside, the old interurban line, at the 20 to 30 miles an hour and the half-mile spacing. You could serve all three, you could serve those different landscapes with the one form of transit. And that's, I think, really why they looked at that as the way to go. They did look at busways, but particularly the rules for busways at that time were actually required more right of way than the streetcar, I mean, than like Max did. And the trolley bus advocated for trolley bus as a replacement, as an alternative. Anything else?
Maybe touch on like the abandonment of the interurban corridors, because I know the Springwater is a path now, and the Oregon City line is a path as well. And like why those were abandoned and redeveloped as opposed to like being reintegrated into the rail system, because a lot of that redevelopment, as I understand, happened while simultaneously planning new rail lines, like especially the Oregon City line, like it was still a rail line when they were planning the original north-south light rail project.
Part of it was.
Yeah.
Not all of it. One of the studies I worked on, working as a consultant, was looking at all the abandoned rail rights of way in the region and using them by TriMet. We proposed a system that used more of them, including the spring water. That didn't go anywhere, partially because there's this whole interest in natural areas that's emerging at the same time. And the spring water is paralleling a stream that had been a salmon stream, and there's interest in restoring it. It's pretty hilly, you know, as you approach it, so it's not as easy to build development close to it. So I kind of get why they made that decision. We looked at using Multnomah as the way to get to Beaverton when the first time we looked at we studied the west side, and concluded that the density in Southwest was so low that it wasn't likely to change very much, so it didn't make a lot of sense. And so, you know, the spring water is a converted line. Multnomah is in the process of being converted to the Red Electric Trail.
Yeah.
So those are happening, and it's kind of a balance between how much do you want the transportation system to emerge, and how much do you want these natural areas to be preserved. And there's quite a bit of give and take between them. I think that's the main, okay?
Thank you so much, Dave. Break for 10 minutes, and we have our guests Sam here, so we'll start at 8:05. So thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
How are you? Nice to
Haven't
see
seen
you.
so long.
Yeah. Look at Very nice to see you. Yeah.
I'm really happy to bring back our former mayor, and your position right now, I don't remember what it is, at the mayor's office, but Sam Adams. You don't need an introduction, Sam, so happy to have you back.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, it's great to be back, and I was the city's transportation commissioner for 8 years. I was the mayor and city's transportation commissioner for 4 years. So I was, the 8-year period was from 2013 to whatever that difference is, 2004. So during that time, transportation issues included a significant, it was during the, I was mayor during the Great Recession. And so during the Great Recession, there was a big collapse in transportation funding. And so that's one bit of sort of context. The other context is I actually ran to be a city commissioner and to be appointed transportation commissioner. And at the time, transportation was kind of the Bureau of Transport, what we now call the Bureau of Transportation, was kind of in rough shape. And so when the Mayor Potter at the time, decided to award transportation initially to someone else on the city council, Eric Sten, a great city commissioner. I was very sad, very disappointed, but luckily Eric Sten said, I don't want that. No. Transportation was the source of the second highest number of complaints. So it was in both good shape in some ways and in ratty shape in other ways. A little bit of background, I grew up in Newport, Oregon. And at the age of 11, so in 1974, I lied so that I could start delivering the Portland Oregonian. And back then there was also a newspaper called the Oregon Journal. And as a queer kid in a kind of a democratic but conservative small town, I not only delivered all the papers, but I read all the papers and sort of fell in love with this place called Portland because I saw there was actual mention back then as homosexuals, but there was mention of queer community in the papers. But there was also at that time in the mid-70s, Portland was going through a very big conversation and argument over transportation issues. Because like a lot of cities, we had lost a lot of population to the automobile flight to the suburbs. So folks like Goldschmidt, the mayor at the time, and others on the city council, and a great staff at the city, and someone who was a neighborhood activist who ended up becoming mayor of Portland and one of my bosses got together and fought the fought there were even more freeways planned, and so they fought expansion of those freeways beyond what you see now, and sought to eventually have those resources turned into what we now call max. So I was reading about sort of this ferment, reading about for things that I could relate to, that they kind of got hooked on urban issues, and especially it was a really interesting time around how we're going to revitalize the city and what role transportation played in that, and specifically rail transit, light rail. This was decades before streetcars. We had the opportunity to bring streetcars back. So I just sort of soaked all that up. I thought it was fascinating. I always wanted to move to Portland, in the middle of Newport. My dad was a commercial fisherman. And at the age of 26, I finally had the opportunity to do that. where I was the campaign manager for Vera Katz, who's Speaker of the Oregon House. You might see her statue on the Esplanade. Ran her campaign, she became mayor. She never, we have a commission form of government. Hopefully you've heard about that. It's on the ballot to change. So we have a historic choice. Do you like the commission form of government, or do you want to go to the new form of government that's been recommended by a charter commission? But the time that Vera really through the 70s and on and off through the 80s and 90s, and you just heard from Steve, who has been part of just some of the best transportation thinkers that happen to be employees of the city of Portland, and really, you know the phrase managing up. So they really managed up to their bureau directors and to their electeds, and really pushed, charmed, and cajoled Portland in really productive ways when it comes to transportation. Mount Hood Freeway, you can see vestiges of it. They tried to, like Outer Powell, where those weird parking lots are, starting about 54th. Well, that was ODOT buying land for a freeway out there. And then there was another freeway plan through Northwest Portland, which is where Vera Katz lived. And so she was a neighborhood advocate. So, no. The other, I guess, part of my background and passion for folks getting around in ways other than driving alone in their automobile is that in Newport, we didn't have a bus system, small town. And so I walked and rode my bike everywhere. And my dad was a passionate bicyclist, so I didn't know any different. So at the age of 12, we started riding. He bought me a bike and we would ride up and down Highway 101. And we rode our bike to Montana to visit his family or my extended family like a couple of times. And I didn't know any better until I asked my friends, and I'm like, "Whoa, do you know?" So a passion for bicycling, just walked. I enjoyed that sort of the contemplation that comes with sort of that speed of transportation. So the reason I wanted to become transportation commissioner is transportation was, it was both sort of the bookends. Transportation at that time, because of revenue sort of declines with the state allocation of gas tax and vehicle registration fees, the city's actual basic maintenance was crap. We had so many potholes, and it was the source of the complaints were around, lack of maintenance on the system, basic system. What I also saw, though, in my time working for Vera Katz, remember, who had never had transportation in her bureau, was an absence of recognizing the absolute urgency around safety. And one year would have been in the aughts, so maybe 2002, these three, what I came to know as three moms from Linton, camped out at the mayor's door, not understanding this weird form of government where she's mayor, but not in charge of all the bureaus. That was somebody else. But they camped out in front of the mayor's door inside City Hall from Linton, wanting to speak to the mayor. So the mayor spent some time with them, asked me to join the meeting as their chief of staff, and I heard what they were facing in Linton. And what they were facing in Linton was an ODOT highway that was the main street of their city. If you've gone to Saudi's Island, you've been through Linton. It used to be an independent city that was annexed into the city of Portland. And they were worried because their kids had to cross Highway 30 to get to school bus or when they're dropped off the school bus. And they were worried that with the unimpeded sort of traffic barreling through as a highway, that someone was going to get hurt. So I took on their plight and went to talk to ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation. You're in Region 1. States divided up in region. And talked to the ODOT director for Region 1 at the time, who couldn't be bothered with this issue. That was my impression. It certainly had been a year's worth of advocacy, the impression of these models. And because the city doesn't have control over ODOT, she could, say this is not a priority. She had other things to worry about. And the kid was killed. The kid was mowed down by a vehicle about 3 months after we discussed it with, on behalf of the mayor, ODOT Region 1. And that really opened my eyes to, yes, maintenance was a problem, but the tradition of transportation from an engineering and roadway perspective did not account for lack of safety as much as I thought it should. And so I ended up, based on advocacy with ODOT, going to the state legislature with these moms, having the mayor go to the state legislature. We got the speed limit down to 35. The speed limit through Linton used to be, I think, 45. And now when you go through Linton, it says 35. Blinks at you, you're going more than 35. That was the legacy of these 3 moms. And we got ODOT to put in the traffic mediums and the trees, all of which slow down traffic. And those blinking lights, we got the city's police department to do more enforcement of the speed limit. And that was the intervention that we're able to achieve there. But it opened my eyes because they began to get connected with other survivors, other victims. Pedestrian victims, bike victims, or survivors, people that were injured. And so I ran, and I was passionate about bicycling, transit. And of course, the transit trip usually begins or ends unless the bus parks in your garage. It ends or begins with a pedestrian trip or bike trip, scooter trip now. So I became an advocate and wanted to run for city council to increase biking, but to do it in a way that didn't put people at harm. And I knew that the perception of danger kept a lot of folks from taking bike. The reality and the perception of danger. And a lot of people wouldn't take bike on trips. That was the fastest trip, the cheapest trip. But not always the safest trip. So I ran, I won, and set to work. And I'll shut up in a minute. You can ask her questions on anything else. But the part that I always like to leave people with is the transportation engineering is changed in this direction. But back then, transportation engineering was definitely focused. And this is where I was passionate about improving maintenance, more passionate about safety. And that was transportation engineering in terms of evaluating transportation systems didn't always take into account what was missing. They would take into account what was there and declining, but they wouldn't necessarily take into account the missing traffic control lights at an intersection. And if you're not taking that into account and that intersection is dangerous, it doesn't necessarily show up. So my team and I, Steve's former team, we went to work to put together the city's first evaluation of the 50 most dangerous places in the city for different modes. And what we found is intersections that were dangerous for pedestrians and bikes often were dangerous for automobiles as well. And so we put that together, we prioritized it, we made sure that we didn't, because most of the dangerous intersections at the time, which, let me, what streets would you say were the most, because they actually probably remain one of the, some of the most dangerous parts of the city, but what would you say the parts of the city that would, roads or streets that would be the most dangerous right now in Portland? Broadway? Which Broadway? Downtown?
Yeah, east side.
East Side Broadway?
Sandy.
Sandy, Stark? Ainsworth? So those were definitely in the mix, and I would say are probably still in the mix. The most dangerous streets in Portland were 122nd, 82nd, and there are more, but these are some of the, definitely Powell, not Ainsworth, West Burnside.
Most dangerous intersection in the state of Oregon is actually 122nd Division.
I'm not surprised. Yeah.
That was 10 years ago, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. The most dangerous place in the entire system was at the Max Transit stop on 82nd Avenue. Because the transit, rail transit, light rail goes underneath. There are two sides, buses going on, and people are just jaywalking and just get mowed down. And so that's an example of the intervention. When you see that sprayed, totally tagged sort of, it used to be an art piece, but that totally tagged sort of barricade with the pipe sticking up, if you've been by there, used to be a beautiful art piece when we put it in a billion years ago. I'm really old. But that went from the dangerous place for pedestrians in the city to like near the bottom. It was so controversial. The neighborhood thought we were like killing them. They were so upset about it. And to their, in fairness, they thought it would get tagged and be ugly. That's what it's turned out. But it's still saving lives. It's still saving lives because it's really hard to climb over. And so it does force you to go around. So the nudges are really important stuff. The nudges, making, the barriers, the nudges. When you see the two white lines between vehicle lane and the traffic lane or the bicycle lane, like those are not only actually make bicycling safer, the perception of bicycling is safer and it's a much higher utilization. We were getting a lot of people mowed down on right and left turns. So the green bike boxes was something that I put into place on the recommendation of the team. Again, you would have thought that, I don't know, I was doing something really controversial, but people got used to it and it saved lives. So my passion is safety, basic maintenance, and then offering options other than driving alone in your car. But I'm going to stop talking and happy to answer questions or comments that talk about things you want to talk about. Yeah.
How would you say that the relationship between the city of Portland and ODOT has changed since the LinkedIn?
I think it's gotten a lot better. She was fired. Retired. And the individual that came in who I ended up working with was really great. So at that time, 82nd Avenue it's just changing over to be a city street highway. So he was very much interested in safety. And so I thought it was a seminal moment for ODOT, just because there was the advocates that predicted something would happen and they were so rebuffed. It really appropriately rattled Region 1, and they made a lot of changes. One of the first things I pursued related to that is a lot of people don't know that the city of Portland does not have the authority to set its own speeds. That we have to go to the state legislature to, like, when I was city transportation commissioner, we had state legislation to lower the basic speed. But we had to go to state legislature to do that on sorry, basic speed on neighborhood streets, so the quiet streets. So we've gotten a little bit more local control. ODA has become much more concerned about safety. So those were some meager silver linings from that death. Yeah.
Do you feel like future transfer of ownership over, like from current state highways to the city should be from the city?
I do. 82nd Avenue is being transferred to the city with resources, not nearly enough to make the kinds of changes that are needed on 82nd Avenue, but they're more than we used to get in the past. But I think putting them in local control allows us to work on them day in, day out. 82nd Avenue, especially 82nd Avenue, is a really tough road. It's going to take, it's going to need a lot of interventions. It's going to be tough because it's so much traffic goes through it, and it's a pretty important connector, but it is so dangerous.
Feel with the community organizations, the community organizers that are the partners right now that the city's working with. Is there more work to do around the community engagement outreach?
Yeah, I love Bike Cloud. And the Oregon Walks is great. And used to be, it's not Grid, what is it called? Street Trust. Street Trust has a grid, so I think it was Grid. Used to work at Street Trust, so it's awesome. They've expanded into sort of a more holistic view of the public right of way, and I think that's good and smart. I think Bike Cloud complements them well, just to sort of, and Bike Portland, and we're lucky to have those Bike Portland, Bike Cloud to be obsessive because the needs of bicyclists complementary but slightly different than pedestrians. And Bike Loud is, when bicyclists, I saw patterns when bicyclists were repeatedly being hit or killed, I would just close streets. So, Bike Portland was there to support that, even when the truckers and other people didn't necessarily support that. And I believe that Bike Loud now complements Street Trust and complements Bike Portland in that kind of advocacy. I also like the fact that they're trying to remind people that it's actually fun. I'm a nerd, so I'm always looking at that, but it is actually fun to ride bike. It's rewarding. Yeah.
How much managing up is being done now? For a lot of talented staff in the department.
There is, yeah.
A lot of challenges relative to budget, team speed,
Yeah.
mobility, prioritizing financial devices, cars, hierarchy.
I think we're through no fault of any particular individual, but I think we're actually at a low point. And being able to manage up in attention to transportation in general, and specifically modes that are not automobile. Facts speak for themselves. Their light rail line, Tiger, failed miserably. I suppose usage is down. There are lots of reasons for that. So it's, again, I'm not saying that the failure, it's just a fact, it's down. I'm not blaming anyone in particular. Pedestrian crashes have been up, all kinds of crashes and all kinds of modes have been bad. So I think pandemic had weird implications. I think I saw the projection up here. I think Portland does best when we sort of dig into that. But not just in engineering. We spend a lot of time. Roger Geller, has he come spoken yet? To the class?
Not yet.
Okay. So we spent a lot of time figuring out, basically being behavioral scientists on why people weren't biking. Bike trips are way down. So why are they way down? Why were they way down during the pandemic? Well, people were staying at home and maybe they didn't have places to go. But we're not seeing them pick up. Now we have scooters and now we have electric bikes. It's a new sort of day. And I think we need to dig in and figure out what's going on. Car usage is up. The number one emitter of greenhouse gas emissions is now the transportation sector. And I don't feel like we have, again, not blaming anybody. We're not leading anymore. Portland isn't leading anymore on sort of these issues. And that's painful. I kind of took that, meandered in an answer to your question, sorry. So I'll be provocative because you're here to, you're provocative or you care about this stuff, you wouldn't. I think we need to really dig into transit. And when I was city commissioner in charge of transportation, I threatened to change the name of the bureau to the Bureau of Go and Get There. And it leaked out to the press because I was talking to employees and they're like, go get there, he's smoking something, Sam. But I think the future of mobility we need to have a piece of our brain, and you're here, have a piece of your thought process of what's the most equitable, sustainable way to, and especially for those that don't enjoy the middle or the upper economic benefits of society. Like, what is the most equitable way to help people get around? Is it really a huge bus all day long that's mostly empty? I'm a huge passionate fan of rail transit, helped build the aerial tram when I was transportation commissioner. I like all that stuff, but I think we need to drain the sort of equipment fetish out of our brains for a little bit and talk about what's the best way to help people get around. Is it a future of, and I'm sure you've talked about it, the future of autonomous vehicles, which I think is a little further off, but it's out there. We have electric vehicles, but we also have massive transit. We have transportation deserts. And folks that are spending, as you've probably studied, when you take transportation deserts, which are pushing people further out that make less and less, is really like, should we be looking at a voucher system, for various, that can be used for various kinds of modes, including van pools, City of Portland. I spent 4 years in Washington, D.C. after I retired as mayor for climate action think tank. And we dug into some of these issues about equity. And it was very controversial that we were looking at mobility vouchers as an option, especially with electric vehicles coming on board and autonomous vehicles coming on board. And I talk about the equipment fetish of mobility, and it really exists. And so I would hope that from this great class that I've talked to over the decades, that you would really look into that. And especially around, it's things like buses, especially buses. If you're working at the nearby Starbucks and you get off at 11 o'clock at night, the bus runs once an hour and you miss it, and by the way, it's 8 blocks from where you live, is that, and it's mostly empty, is that really an expression of mobility and sustainability and equity? Or if the voucher said that you could do some sort of van, Uber, Lyft, whatever, and it's EV in order to be able to take the vouchers, and you could go when you wanted, where you wanted, and near door to door, what's better? You know, the technology is getting to the point now where we get to have these conversations. What that doesn't give you is transit-oriented development, which is a real thing. That's a real thing. So I'm not saying that this is the way to go. I'm just saying that we need to engage in this kind of conversation. We need to think about what people need, as opposed to what equipment we're most fascinated with.
Do you have any other unpopular opinions?
Yeah, that's an unpopular opinion, isn't it?
Well, not.
It is an unpopular opinion. Yeah, there are a pet peeve. The rideshare industry have a pet peeve, and that is some cities, and it shows to me sort of a low point in our aspirations. So most cities, there's a different tax per rider if you get the single Uber Lyft. It's just you, you might have a friend. Whereas if you sign up for the Uber pool or the Lyft something, that you know you're going to be picked up, maybe not right in front of your house, but 20 feet from your house, and you're going to be in a car with other people. Most other large cities tax that ride less than you driving alone in your Escalade with your driver. So it's, for some reason, unpopular in Portland to say there should be different taxes on that. You should be rewarded with less cost, less tax if you're taking the pool than if you're driving alone with your driver in the Escalade. Yeah.
To me, it seems like single-use automobile trips just don't pay enough for how much their usage costs in terms of, road wear, noise pollution, and all those sorts of things. So what are some ways you think that the city can incentivize, restructure payments, I guess?
Yeah, it's we're and now with absolutely low intention and good stuff that was passed in the Build Back Better or the anti-inflation one, where EVs are going to be incented, and then there's going to be less gas, and we rely on the gas tax and vehicle registration fee. I mean, another unpopular thing is we're going to have to go to a system at some point, probably after the vehicle roadway system is in amazing disrepair because gas taxes. We're gonna have to pay for the system, and we're gonna have to pay for all the deliveries that are gonna have to pay for them. And even if you don't use a car, you're still massively hooked up to automobiles. If you order from Amazon or a delivery vehicle from the local order from the delivery vehicle from the local business. We're gonna have to pay some sort of, to your question, we're gonna have to pay some sort of maintenance fee for all that. And there are plenty of think tanks in Washington, D.C. that imagine massive gridlock with autonomous EVs. And what about that? And on top of that, are those EVs going to be accessible to folks that are lower income, that might not be able to afford that car? So there's a lot, I'm glad you're in this class, there are a lot of challenges ahead of us that need a lot of sort of really, really radical, fresh thinking. And Portland needs to be a place, a locus and a focus center for that. So I'm glad you care about transportation enough to be here at 8:38. Yeah. Any other question or comment? You're about,
Just that if we're not meeting anymore, I mean, other same-sized communities probably experience the same challenges. with affordable housing and all.
Yeah.
Related pieces that are impacting communities. So who is then that we need to be chasing again? Is it the usual suspects, or are there particular communities that really stand out that we should be reaching out to?
well, every chance I get, I love to go to Nordic countries because as you probably have learned in this class, the most valuable trip is the trip not taken. And the best way to prevent the trip from being taken, in addition to working at home on Zoom, is during my time as transportation commissioner, we established the goal of the 10-minute walkable neighborhood. So, and that means some of the most effective transportation policies are to make sure you have complete neighborhoods. And even in Portland, that's controversial because most of Portland doesn't have a lot of Portland doesn't have a 10-minute walk to a grocery store, a bar, place you want to entertain. There's swaths of the city. So imagine putting together a little sort of intersection of all that stuff. What's the neighborhood? Forest Heights, you know, if you've been up in the West Hills. But that would cut down trips. Paris stole our idea, and now they're, I think, a 3-minute walk neighborhood. And pretty soon it's going to be a open your door neighborhood. No, that's good. And you've seen it, you probably learned the intersection that really smart transportation isn't, the investments and thinking isn't always literally about transportation. It's about people not having to take trips at all. So Nordic countries, anything with that has sort of internal, like if I guess in part of the city, if the city signs off on any new crossing on the Columbia River that doesn't have congestion pricing, then someone should be thrown in the Columbia River because
Could that be your most radical statement?
yeah, because there are tax advantages beyond tax advantages to work in Portland and live there. And anything that allows more traffic that doesn't help pay for the bridge, but also, you know, congestion pricing. I mean, it just works in a whole bunch of different applications, but they're gonna have to fight to get that, you know, and that honestly is more important. I'll be another radical statement that is much more important to me than making sure light rail gets to Vancouver. Is tough, fair congestion pricing for those. Now with the technology, you can have congestion pricing credits if you're lower income. I mean, the technology exists to do all this stuff. Let's use it. Thanks.
We are at.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Glad you're all here. Stay at it. You can just sign me at the current